Okay, hello to all of you who are still there. Thanks to Stick Hero. Sorry for the late start today. Had some issues on my end, but that's no big deal. I'm here now, so let's get started. Let's dive right in. This evening, I'm going to be going back to basics. I didn't have so much of a plan like I normally do, but I'm going to be going back to the basics of design, some basic techniques like shading and tracing and that kind of stuff, so that those of you who wouldn't have been here in the early days, who would have missed that kind of thing, can actually get some of that information. So we're not doing the Humanity project today. We're going to be going to the basics of design, some pretty simple and straightforward stuff. And if you have any suggestions, you can drop them in the chat and I will get to that as well. Alright, so before we really dive into the fullness of it, make sure you share this and follow me on Twitch and YouTube if you haven't followed me yet, so that you can catch up on my next stream anytime that I go live. Alright, so let me switch to Inkscape. But for those of you who are new, Inkscape is an open source digital graphics editor. Well, it really is for editing vector graphics, but you can do all kinds of digital graphics with it, even though it uses vector as the basis that you're working with. It's it's an SVG editor, really and truly, but it can output PNG and it can also export to various other formats. So I like to describe it more as a digital graphics editor than just an SVG editor, because you're doing digital graphics in general, right? Now what I'm going to do is actually try to find a picture for us to trace today. Before we do that, let me just write here what we're going to be doing so you don't forget. Oops, I have that too thick, sorry. Alright, I did that kind of poorly. I could just type this, but I'm being fancy for no reason. Alright, one more time I'm going to take a try at this. Excuse my very professional looking handwriting. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. That's not the best that I've seen. Okay, so let me pull up a picture for us to trace. I'm going to try to choose something not too complicated. How about this guy? Yeah, this should work. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move this to another layer so we can work on it when we're ready. So let me just drop this on layer 2, rename this to tracing. Then I'm going to turn that layer off so that it's not in the way. Let's call this layer shading. This layer, we'll call this backdrop. And for those of you who haven't been in previous streams before, the reason why I usually have a backdrop layer is because you typically want to have an actual background. Inkscape doesn't actually add a background to your images, it's just a blank image. So if I turn on the icon view, for instance, you'll see, let me add an object, and if I select this, you'll see that this is actually technically blank. So if I were to add a background to it, alright, I need to change the color of the other object as well. Oh, I forgot that was at the bottom. Right, if I actually add a background to it now, you can actually see that it's filled in and all that. If I were to move this to another layer, let me move this one up and turn off the background. This should more easily demonstrate the difference. See? So typically you want to work with a background if you're going to be exporting this image to something. Well, it's obviously going to export a PNG because that's what Inkscape uses, but if you're going to export it to something, say like you know, a book cover or anything like that, and you want to have a background and not just a blank something, you should add a background layer. But that's only if that's what your plan is. Anyway, let me turn this white. And this here, this can... need to rename this to... let me just call it random. I'll just leave this here for now. We'll get back to that shortly. Oh, just give me a second, folks. Let me share this on social media because Twitch does not do that for you automatically, so I have to actually notify everyone else that I'm on streaming and all that. So just 1 second. Alright, that's done, so let me jump right in. Sorry to keep you waiting just now. We're going to start with tracing. I was actually contemplating in my head whether to go with tracing or shading first, but tracing first is what we're going to do. So, where am I? I got lost on my own screen just now. This is what happens when you have two screens and too many tabs open. I actually got lost on my own computer. But anyway, yes. Let's jump right back in. I'm going to start with tracing today, so what I'm going to do is jump into the tracing layer and resize this image so that it fits the canvas correctly. And then I'm going to align it to the center of the page. And since I'm not going to be using this image itself when I'm done, I'm not going to clip it. Normally what I would do is I would add another object like this, and then select the image using the shift key and click. So you shift click to select both of them and then set click, and I would use it like this. But I'm not doing that this evening because the point, of course, is not to actually, you know, use this image itself. We're going to be tracing the lizard over the image and then we're going to recreate it basically. So there are two ways you can do this. I can use this same object that I just added. I can convert object to path. Of course, I want to make this somewhat translucent, and I can then move these points around into position. And trace the lizard like this. But of course this is tedious and less accurate. I can add more points in between, obviously, and keep moving points around until I get the result that I want. But as I just said, that's pretty tedious and not necessarily ideal. Of course, it does come into play at a point with the other method I'm about to show you, because you do need to actually create an object that fits the shape of what you're creating to complete it. But you don't have to use that method either at all or immediately. It will come into play, as I said, but that's because we're going to create an actual solid object. But you don't have to be creating a solid object. You could just be tracing the outline of the lizard. So there are two ways you could do that. You could use the calligraphic tool, or you can use the freehand lines and you can trace with your mouse like this, which is not that accurate obviously, or you can trace with a graphics tablet, which I just so happen to have, and that is a lot more accurate. And in this case I'm actually going to use the calligraphic tool because I much prefer that. Allows me to be a little more accurate than if I were using my hand with the mouse. The thing is, you don't need to be exact and perfect with this. It's just basically to get the basic shape of the lizard. And if you're like me and you sometimes have trouble drawing in certain directions, try drawing from the other direction. And don't worry about getting continuous lines, that's not really the point here. You're just basically trying to get an outline to work with. Now I'm trying to remember because I don't remember offhand, but I believe Inkscape does have a tool that allows you to fill lines like this when you're done. I have to double check that, because I was playing with some features the other day that I didn't even remember it had, and I found one that allowed me to fill in some lines that were already drawn, which is very useful. I think pretty much any application should have something like that. Any graphics application, it really saves you a lot of time. Right, that was really bandy just now. Let me do those lines over again. Now you may be telling yourself, why do I need to learn this? This is extremely simple and basic stuff that you learn when you're in school. Well, everything in life is basically just stacking simplicity, and that's a line that you'll hear me use a lot in all of my streams. Whenever you're designing, you're just stacking simplicity. So it starts very basic and builds on top of that basic level. It doesn't really change from that. It just becomes more and more basic. I'm not gonna say it becomes more and more complex, because really and truly Complexity is just simplicity repeated. So that's basically all you're doing, just using the same simple strategies and tools and stacking them on top of one another, and that's how you get complexity. So even what we're doing here, it may look like it's just basic, school level stuff, and it is. But when you add on top of this, that's when you get complexity. So what looks very basic and simple right now, you give it time and practice, and it becomes a whole lot better. Right, I think I have a pretty good idea of what this outline should be. Let me just add the mouth as well, because at some point I may want to actually remember where this was. Everything really and truly depends on how much detail you want to add. If you're just doing a very basic design, like you want something more cartoonish, you don't need all that much detail. If you're like me and you tend to try to aim for realism, you can add as much detail as you want. It doesn't really matter per se. Like, it's not an absolute. It's really up to you. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is delete this image, select everything, and turn it to a color we can actually see. There you go. So that was the basics of tracing, but now we can actually step this up some levels. So the first thing I'm going to do, select everything, go to path, and choose union. So now when I go into the node editor, you'll see that all of these are now one object. And then with this selected, I can simplify, which is Control L on your keyboard. You don't want to do this too much because you'll lose some detail. But another thing you could do, I just accidentally did undo a little too much there. Alright, let me make sure everything is back to one object. Good, there we go. So right, like I was saying, another thing you could do, go into the node editor and select everything and then add some more nodes. If your computer is pretty old, I don't suggest doing this too often because it can slow things down, as you can see. But after you've done that, you can then simplify, and it will give you a little bit more to work with without simplifying too much to the point where you lose detail. Okay, so that's one method you could work with, but I don't necessarily suggest sticking to this unless that's what you're going for. Like, this is the basic idea that you want to go for. You should basically combine this with the other method that I would have started with. So what I'm going to do now, just like I would have started out, I showed you that you could use an object, turn it to a path, and then move some points around. But I'm going to try to make this quick so that it doesn't become too boring, because this process can take a while. Oops, didn't mean to select all those. To save some time, let me just subdivide this quite a number of times. Right, there we go. That should be a lot easier to work with. Now you may have noticed by now that there's some strategy here what I'm doing, which is that I'm getting a rough idea of where the overall outline is, and then I'm going to add points in the other areas, sorry, where I need to refine things a little bit. So I'm going to just add some points at the bottom here, and then move these around. Now Inkscape has a tool that can actually make this job slightly easier. Like if I were to subdivide this quite a number of times, I could then use this tool here, tweak objects by sculpting and painting, which is W on your keyboard, and you can actually shift things around. Let me see which one I have selected. I don't always get the best results with. Okay, there we go. I don't always get the best results with it, so you have to tweak the settings a little bit before it works exactly as you want. But right, there we go. That saves me a lot of time. I don't use it that often though, because I'm more of a hands-on type of designer. I'm not one who always likes to rely on the tools, the built-in tools, but for those of you who need that stuff, I'm still going to demonstrate it because obviously it's very useful. And even for hands-on people like me, it's still useful to know what's available, because sometimes you need to save some time. You don't have time to sit and tweak and play around, so still useful to know. And this part can actually become some fun, as you can see. I think you should be basically getting the hang of this, so I'm not going to go through all of what needs to be done, because it would take a while, as you can imagine. Right, so that's basically the gist of it in terms of tracing, and you can then tweak this from here and add as much detail as you want. So me just to give you a rough idea of what it would look like in the final sense, I'm going to just give it some color, and then I'm going to add some shading on top of it. Very, very rough. This is definitely not a finished product that I'm aiming for here. Whoops, didn't mean to have that selected. Now if you wanted, you could have kept the image around as a reference. I didn't in this case just because I'm kind of saving some time, but typically I tend to keep the image around as a reference, and then from there you can build what you're trying to build on top of it. In fact, I still have it open, so let me just pull it across and see how we're doing. Not looking too bad, at least for a roughly cartoonish figure. It's not too bad. Now for those of you who may be wondering why I'm not using a regular program like, say, Photoshop or maybe GIMP or any other raster graphics editor, and I'm using vector graphics, is because I really like the fact that you can scale everything when you're doing vector graphics. Plus, for me personally, it's a little more natural of a feel, I guess. By the way, forgive me if I sound a little funny today. Some dust in the area, so I may sound a little stuffy compared to how I normally sound. And that's also probably why I'm not doing voice impressions and stuff like that today. But I'm fine otherwise. Alright, I'm not going to add any more detail to this. That basically should give you the gist of how to do tracing in Inkscape. So I'm going to move on to something much more involved and much more interesting, in my opinion at least. Tracing is fun, but it's somewhat simple and straightforward, so you can figure that out, I guess, on your own. I do have past streams on it where I think I might hit in more detail, but if not, I'll probably review my content and see if I need to come back to it, because I've actually done some pretty in-depth stuff with it before, and it takes some time, so I may break it down in the future in more detail. But for now, we're going to move on to shading. Let me remove this. And actually what I'm going to do is grab this object from random and move it to shading. Not create link. I meant I meant move to layer. Alright, so let me make this into a ball of equal dimensions. And before I actually get into it, let me explain a little something when it comes to shading. When you're shading, basically what you're doing is trying to simulate the effect of light. So what I typically do when I'm teaching this is I use a fake light source. There are no actual light sources in Inkscape. You can add fake 3D objects like these, and then you can tweak them a bit so that, you know, it looks like if the light is falling off or different size and all that. To me, they're useful to an extent, especially if you want to understand the concepts of how shading works, but I don't use them too much, and I'm not really a big fan of them. They're there, they exist, but unless there's some functionality that I haven't found yet, not my biggest thing. So what I'm going to show you actually is what I typically envision in my head when I'm doing it. And in that case, I typically envision a light source. So let's say we have the sun over here. Sun isn't black in real life, obviously. That's just the last color I use. That was supposed to be 64, not 646. Right, so let's say we have the sun over here, and then the fall off of the light is going in this. Let me use the calligraphic tool actually, going in this direction toward the object that we're looking at. So what I'll typically do when I'm teaching this is draw a cone like this. Obviously that is a rectangle, but I'm going to turn it into a cone, don't worry. Just need to delete this point. Right, there we go, that's more of a cone. Something roughly like this. So this is what I try to do when I'm simulating lighting, and this should give you an idea of where you have to shade, how you're supposed to shade. So what's happening here is that your light source is giving you the majority of your light on this side, the right side of the object, and the other side then, which should be getting less light, should be darker. Which is pretty simple and straightforward to imagine in your mind, at least I would hope so. I hope that's not too complicated. And it should be easy then to simulate. Now there are a number of ways that we can simulate this. You can use a gradient, which is obviously the most straightforward way to do it. So I just created a gradient, and of course I turn this side back to being fully opaque. But this side here on the left, you'll just make this color darker, and then you can just move this point around to the point where you want it to be at. That's the most basic way to shade an object. Of course, if you're trying to simulate light coming from one side or another, that's the most basic and straightforward way to do it. Let me turn this back to a solid color and show you another method that you can use. You can duplicate the object, resize it, and change its color to something darker. Then you can move this, say, like in this direction, and blur it. And this gives you somewhat more realistic results because the fall off is more natural. I can make this a little bigger as well. And then if you're not satisfied with that, you can duplicate that object and move it around. Just make sure that it doesn't create a shadow behind the other object. The way you can make sure of preventing that, go to icon preview, sorry, and select this panel down here, and it should show you where things are falling off, so you can actually see if the shadow shows up outside the object or not. That should help you to avoid fall off. Well, fall off outside of the object you're working with, I mean. You can resize this as many times as you need, or duplicate it as many times as you need, and resize them and move them around so that you get different results. And obviously, as I said, this is much more natural than if you were working with just a regular gradient. But if you want, you can combine the two. So what I'm going to do is actually duplicate the original object, create a gradient. Let me move this down so it's below the light source, or let me move the light source up, actually that's more accurate. And then I'm going to shift the gradient around, let me just change these values a bit. Right, now the reason why you would use this is that this makes your fall off even more natural, because now you can adjust where the color is supposed to be absolutely solid. You can bring that up to here. Let me give some transparency to this light, by the way, so we can actually see what we're working with. Right. So right, this allows you to put the color where it needs to be more solid, and you can shift it around as needed and get even better results. And this is typically the method that I will use when I'm shading. I try to combine the first method I showed you, which was just a simple gradient, and the second method I showed you, which is to add other objects. But you can go even a step further than that to add some realism. So let's say that this is not just a solid rubber ball, this is a shiny marble or something like that. Let me just move this light source up because we don't really need this anymore. This is just for simulation purposes. What I typically do for something like this, say if it's shiny and it has some glare or some sheen on it, I will add calligraphic strokes. I'm going to make them kind of big this time. So I'll go to the corner where the light is going to be reflecting most. Oh, that looks really nice. I like that. Oops, why did I press undo? Now, depending on the source of light, you can choose to either make it white, which is the typical color that you'll be working with when you're shading and putting sheen or anything like that on something, or you can make it the color of your light source. Well, in this case, I don't want to leave it the color of the light source because I'm going to be removing that light source, and I'm going to be leaving it as natural lighting, which would typically give you white unless the object itself has an effect on the color. I can't remember the term for that scientifically. There's a term for that, and we use it in 3D a lot, but it's not coming back to my memory right now. But in any case, you can adjust the opacity as much as you need. In this case, I'm going to just turn it right up to 100. Simplify this object a bit as well so that it has a smoother fall off. And then I'm going to blur it. You don't want to blur it too much because then it will not give you the effect that you're going for. But after blurring, sometimes you may need to adjust the opacity just to make sure you're getting the result you're looking for so it looks more natural. You can duplicate that object as well and shift it a bit, adjusting opacity and blurring as much as you need to so that you get the natural result you're going for. Now, me and my numbers, man, so you'll see me sometimes adjust these numbers here to something more exact, but you don't need to do that. That's just me personally. And I do have a reason for that, which I'll probably explain in either in another stream or in a YouTube tutorial. Something that I personally have found to be the case, and something I notice in nature, is that numbers tend to remain consistent, like the Fibonacci series, for instance. So there has to be something to it that, even though our brains may not consciously pick it up, it does have some sort of meaning. So I tend to typically keep certain numbers intact. But as I said, I'll explain that in a future stream or possibly in a future YouTube video. Now, you'll notice that where these objects intersect, you get a different effect, and that's actually intentional. What is happening here is you're overlaying a transparent object or a translucent object on top of another one, and it's giving you a heavier color, and that basically can simulate the effect of more light being concentrated on that particular area. So you can capitalize on that when you're trying to do shading like this. Gives you a nice realistic effect. Alright, I'm going to select all of these one time and adjust them together a little bit. Actually, let me group them as well. Oops, I did not mean to ungroup those. Now, depending on what effect you're going for, you can have multiple areas where there's some shine on this. Not necessary to do that, but you can do that if you want to, and if that is the effect that you're going for. So in this case, I'm just going to add another small area down here, but it's not really necessary to do that. What I'm also going to do is add a semicircle down here. Not really a true semicircle, but I'm going to open this up a little bit. So you just select any of these points here and drag them around. And then I'm going to just adjust this a little bit. Now, one of the things that I'll let you into, a secret I'll let you in on, is that design is just as much experimentation as it is pre-existing knowledge. So every time you're designing, you're doing experiments basically. It's a visual experiment, you could call it. So it's not just about knowing the techniques, it's about knowing how to take those techniques and experiment with them as you go to produce the results that you're looking for. Alright, so with this in place, I'm gonna blur this a bit. And this is to help with the realism of this area being darker than the rest of the object. I'm going to try and select the one at the bottom. Right, there we go. Now what you can do to make this even more even is to make the base object a little bit darker. Right, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. And now this begins to look a lot more realistic. Now, as you can imagine, this process can take a while, depending on, of course, the final result you're going for. You can tweak this and tweak this and tweak this and tweak this, but that should give you a basic idea of what it is that goes into shading in a 2D space. Because of course I just created what looks like a 3D object, but it is not. It's just flat two-dimensional objects, and they're overlaid on top of one another. And as you can see, everything is very simple and basic at the core, but it looks complicated, and that's why I like to say stat simplicity. Okay, just gonna shift this stuff around a little bit to satisfy my mind's eye. Seeing as we already know basically where the shading is supposed to go, I remove the imaginary light source that we had. We don't need that anymore. But what I am going to show you now, another aspect of shading, is shadows. Now Inkscape does have an extension that you can use that will add drop shadows for you automatically, and you can learn and use that. I'll probably cover that and some other extensions and filters and stuff in another stream, but for today I'm going to just show you the method that I typically use, which is to create my own shadows, because they're much more flexible than if you're using an extension or a filter to accomplish it. So what I'm going to do is lock this layer here. Since random is empty, I'm going to move this and rename it. So what I typically do, say like I'm working with an object like this that's just a solid shape, and the shadow is going to be a solid shape, I don't need to duplicate it. I can create from an object I already know that would match it. So a circle will do. And if you're going for a more or less flat 2D kind of look, this is good enough. Just add a dark circle behind it, and that's a good enough shadow. But typically you want to do a little more than that, so you can blur it and then adjust that as you need it to give you the effect you're going for. You can adjust the opacity, you can add a gradient, you can do a number of different things. Oh, I forgot I blurred the layer. I didn't mean to blur the layer. I should have blurred from fill and stroke. So I just turned off the layer blur and going back to fill and stroke now to blur from here. You can adjust this shadow as much as you want, and the reason why you're going to be using shadows in this manner is that shadows help to add some realism to what you're working with, basically. But that's just one method of doing it. Of course, you can also add some calligraphic strokes, or you can use lines if you want. You can do a more rough shadow like this. Now don't mind that everything is appearing above the object. It's actually going to go behind because we're working on a layer that's behind it. It just shows you where everything would go first, and then it hides them according to the layer that they're in. This can give you a more realistic look if that's what you're aiming for. In that there's an uneven. It was getting kind of tongue twisted there for some reason. There's an uneven fall off as opposed to an even fall off, and then if you want, you can add some more on top of this, which is what I'm about to do here. That's closer to the object itself. And as I said, you can tweak this as much as you want to get as much realism as you want. So that's basically the basics of shading, and of course I did more of a 3D shade, but you can do it in multiple other ways. So like take for instance if I were doing a face. Actually let me do this on a different layer so that we don't get confused. And I'm actually going to save myself some time since I already have faces drawn in the Humanity project. I'm going to reuse those instead of using a new face altogether. Alright, let's use this lovely lady here. Already nicely drawn and everything, so I don't need to do much with her. Oops. I forgot that this had so many layers in it, so let me see. Right, there we go. That's what I wanted to do, not activate all those extra layers. Alright, so with her, I'm going to use this object here that makes up her face. First I'm going to give it a color. And then of course now when you're doing shading of the human face, the fall off is different because we're not so much concerned about the light sources and all that stuff. You're more concerned with features. Okay, so let's say we want to give her some cheeks. And she's blushing for whatever reason, like maybe she just got flowers. Or maybe what happened is she saw when I accidentally turned on all the other layers that are included with this object and she was shocked that her face looked like that. Alright, so I just made sure. What I did is I just centered those horizontally using the biggest object. They're all the same size, but according to Inkscape's, or let me word that differently. Inkscape, as far as it sees, it doesn't matter if one object is bigger or not. It's just that instead of using the page to align them, it uses one object or another. So if they're the same size, biggest object does the same thing basically. And then I group them and align the group to the page so that everything is centered perfectly. And now we can ungroup them again and go back to fill and stroke and turn up the blurry. Now this doesn't only have to be with blushing. Let's say if you were doing somebody with makeup on or something, you can use this same method. So you basically want to match the color on either side and then just blur it a bit. You can use this method, of course, even without makeup. This is not that technical. This is just basically to give you a rough idea of the basics of how it will work. Can add some more of this somewhat randomly. Now, the other term that I use other than stacking simplicity is organized chaos. And you'll notice that with natural things, oftentimes that is the case, that there's a lot of organized chaos in nature. It's not that things are actually random, but it's that they appear to be random, but they're still somewhat organized. So that element of apparent randomness gives you a feeling of things being natural, whereas the element of things being organized makes your brain feel a little more, if you will, at home. So that's why I like to talk about organized chaos. If you look at nature, you'll see it everywhere. So in this case, I'm not going to be putting this one as even. I'm going to put some random color around her face in different areas. Oops, wrong object selected just now. Alright, that should be basically it for that. Don't need to do too much with this, but basically just to give you an idea of how you would shade a human face. There are other ways you can do this as well. You can use a gradient and shade it slightly, or you could add some, like a darker color down here near the chin, or slightly lighter color on the forehead if you were doing, say, like somebody who had their face kind of shiny or whatever, or if they had an idea, you can simulate different ideas like that. But of course, everything, keeping it basic, keeping it simple, and just stacking simplicity. I'm not going to overcomplicate things today because I don't want to go into the complex side of life, if you will. I'm trying to keep it as basic as simple as possible. So let me show you another natural object that you can use. I'm not going to keep you too much longer now. So what I'm going to do is a leaf. So first I'm actually going to create that leaf. Don't worry so much about my methodology this time, because there are multiple ways to skin I nearly said to skin a cat. I think that's a Bajan saying, but that's kind of cruel. So there are multiple ways to create a leaf. Let me put it that way. By the way, I don't know where we get sayings like that from. There are multiple ways to skin a cat. Why would we say that? Who actually goes around skinning cats? Alright, so that's basically the shape of the leaf now. And we are going to move on to adding some detail first. Detail isn't shading itself, but detail is pretty important, not only for realism, but to help your brain to recognize what it's looking at. So I'm going to add first the rib of the leaf. Don't worry if this is not completely straight, because we can fix that using Simplify, which is Ctrl L on the keyboard. Run that a few times, and there you go. It looks nice and straight. And then we're going to add some veins in the leaf. And again, don't worry if these are not completely straight, because we're going to use the same simplify tool and fix that. Alright, that's too thick, so let me turn that down. Alright, so using control, we are going to select all these veins, and then we're going to use Control L or simplify. Oops. I was holding the wrong key, by the way, so I didn't select I didn't select all of them, I mean. So let me try that again. And it's not Control, it's Shift. I don't know why I said Control. Yes, so there we go. Now if you hold shift while you're rotating, you can actually rotate around the center. That's what I did just now. Oh, sorry folks, the music stopped to let me restart that. Okay, so these veins and this rib of the leaf shouldn't be so obvious necessarily, so let me choose a different color for them. Alright, and then I'm going to group them, duplicate them, and blur them a little bit. And the reason why I'm doing this, you don't have to, but the reason I'm doing this is I'm aiming for a slightly more realistic effect than the cartoonish look that I would typically go for if I was doing this to use online or anywhere like that. I tend to be more of a realism person. Most people these days go for flat design and all these other modern themes. I'm not so much that kind of person, but of course I can do it if I have to. It's just not my personal taste, or at least most of the time it isn't, but I'm trying to practice it more now because that's what everyone else wants, and you have to give the people what they want, you know? Alright, so we have the rib and the veins in place. We just make sure all of these are grouped again. And now we're going to go to the leaf itself. Now there's a number of ways you can shade something like this that's more natural looking. You can add a gradient as I would have shown you earlier. You can add a radial gradient, which I'm going to use this time around. You can also add a mesh gradient, which I'm not going to demonstrate today, but mesh gradients are very useful, especially with natural objects, because they give you a lot more control. Now in the case of a leaf, you have a number of things to consider, which is the natural color of the leaf itself, but also the fall off of light. So it depends on the scene you're creating. Like say if I were doing an indoor scene and the light is coming generally from, you know, all around, and I don't really have to be so much concerned about shadows and all those different things, I may just leave this as it is. If I were doing an outdoor scene and there's some other stuff around it, I'll have to consider the idea of multiple light sources, so I may use a mesh gradient for that, for instance. But in this case, I'm not as much concerned about light sources. I'm concerned more about the color of the natural color of the leaf itself. And if you look at real life leaves and other natural objects, you'll notice that there typically tends to be a fall off to them even when there's no light, and that's because there's different thicknesses. Well, not I shouldn't say not no light. When there's no directional light, there are different surfaces of different thicknesses, different materials, etc., etc. So you will see that a leaf, for instance, is not evenly shaded, at least in most cases. So you want to try to recreate that and simulate it. And so to do that, I start with a gradient. Then I'm going to duplicate this and make it solid, make it lighter. And don't worry, I'm not leaving it there as is, because the point is not to hide what's beneath it. Alright, so if the color I want, I'm going to hold shift and resize the object I just created. Then hold control and resize in this direction and this direction. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is blur this. Then adjust the opacity. And then move this down so that it's beneath the ribs and veins. And now it's beginning to look a little bit more like an actual real life leaf. Now on the outside of the leaf you also want to add an outline in this case. So I'm going to duplicate it and turn stroke on. Make sure it's solid. I had used dots before in the previous project, so that's why Inkscape is choosing them again. Now I can leave it like this, nice and thick, but I don't want it to be so thick, so I'm going to turn it down to something like 1. Alright, that's practically invisible, so let me make it thicker than that. Now in this case, I'm not going for full-on realism, so that's why I'm using an outline in the first place. Well, part of the reason why I'm using an outline, because sometimes you can use it for full-on realism, but you should also use a gradient in cases like that. And in this case, I'm going for a slightly more realistic look, but still somewhat cartoonish. So I'm not gonna go for the full detail that I would go for if I were doing something more realistic. Alright, so you can adjust the color on this a little bit. I was going to adjust the opacity, but then I remembered that because I'm not using this directly on top, but actually more like around, it's not going to work exactly as I want. So I'm going to leave opacity at 100%. Blur it a little bit. Now blurring does change the opacity slightly, but don't worry about that too much because I'm actually going to be duplicating this and putting a more solid line around it. Can adjust the color on this a bit. Actually, let me use a gradient for this too. Just to give it a nice fall off. Now if you're wondering sometimes why my preferences pop up occasionally, that's a known bug in Inkscape where sometimes if you select one tool and then another tool quickly, it acts as a double click and for some reason opens the preferences for that particular tool. Can be kind of annoying to be honest, but it is a known bug and apparently it's fixed in the next release, so I'm just waiting on that to land. There we go again. And sometimes you need to sit and tweak and tweak and tweak until you're completely satisfied. But I think this looks pretty good. Now the ribs here, I'm going to ungroup these for a minute because I want to... Actually, let me try something here. Yeah, I'm going to ungroup these because I actually want to combine them all. Alright, so union and union. I'm not sure why that looks so big. Sometimes wrangling with everything in Inkscape can be a little difficult. It'd be easier if we were using the XML editor and actually see that thing from there, but I don't typically like to do that. There's also object view in Inkscape now that I could have used as well, but I haven't turned that on, so that's why you don't have that. Alright, there we go. Now that we've done all this, let's turn this into something a little more useful. I think I've covered some pretty good stuff today. I could add some more shading to this, like make it a variegated leaf and all that, but I'm not going to do all that. What I'm going to do is group all of these together. And if you're wondering, by the way, why this blurred outline or only leaf is because I'm going to resize it and duplicate it and actually create a plant from it. So the blurred outline, when it's resized, of course going downward, not upward, because if you make it bigger it will not look all that good. But the blurred outline actually gives you a nice fall off to the leaf when you resize it downward. Without that outline, it still looks okay, but it doesn't look as realistic. So that's why I use that. I hope you've been enjoying this today. By the way, I've had some fun going back to basics. I'm going to be resuming the Humanality project shortly and showing you how to create some other things other than human faces using the same principles that we would have been covering there and using the same basic tools or basic shapes and stuff to build other things. So we're going to be building some animals and some objects and different stuff like that, and probably combine them into something, because I plan to take the Humanality project even further, but I'm not going to telescope every plan as yet. You will get to find out in time what I plan to do with it. Alright, so that looks pretty nice there. Let me actually group all of these so we can move them around more easily. Alright, we'll put her over here. And this ball now we will select to this, and the shadows, group all these and hide them behind here. Or then again, let me see if I flip this right. No, I don't think we need this lizard anymore, so let me turn that back off. And just for fun, I'm gonna give her a rough body. You do that again. I hope that you're seeing just how easy it is to turn very, very simple things into much more complicated designs. So that design isn't actually as hard as it looks, and it isn't actually as scary as it looks. It's just a simple matter of taking the time to realize how things are broken down and then rebuild them. Kind of like using Legos, basically. But it's just that in this case, you're building the Legos yourself and choosing the shapes you want and then putting them in place. Now, for all of your sakes, I'm not going to take too much longer on this. I'm soon done. I could go forever when I'm designing because I love it and I get caught into it. But I'm going to try to finish this off very, very quickly. Just giving her a rough design with some rough looking arms. Obviously no Mona Lisa, but hey, not too bad. And now let's just give this all a nice background. So we're gonna put her on a road. Alright, and there we go. There's a nice looking scene using very, very simple, very basic elements. If you've not seen before how I did this face, you can go back and watch the Humanity Project videos on YouTube. But I think I'm going to cut it short today. Well, not short, I'm going to cut it here today because we've gone for nearly an hour and a half. But I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've had some fun. And I hope that basically this has shown you how simple, how easy design really is. And I hope it encourages you to come back, because I'm going to be covering some more in the future, and I'm going to be showing you some other techniques and hopefully helping you to gain some skills along the way. You can look out for more YouTube videos as well to drop soon, because I have some ideas in mind in terms of tutorials and other stuff I want to get to in Inkscape. And I'm also going to start showing you some other applications, open source applications that I use in design, and even one that I started learning recently despite knowing about it for years and years and years. I haven't used it before, like maybe a week ago. So yeah, but I'm going to start showing you some other applications as well soon, and some other techniques like painting and stuff like that, which I personally don't do that much, but I'll be returning to my roots in that sense. And we'll also hang out and have some fun. Oh, and of course, you CSS people out there, you web designers, I am planning to start a series very soon on my streams where I will be actually building websites based on mockups, but I may also be building mockups on stream, and then in future streams building the website to go with the mockup. So we'll be covering all that good stuff. So until next time, I am Roland Taylor, or Roland Dick, sorry if you're following me on anything else. You can subscribe, you can like, you can share, and if you haven't seen the full video today, you can always go back to my YouTube channel and watch it from there. Make sure you tell a friend, tell your family, tell your cat, tell your dog. They can't use Twitch or YouTube, but still tell them, because it's nice to let them know what's going on. Tell your pet fish too, because I'm sure they'll be very interested. Even your pet tarantula or whatever you have. Tell everybody, come and subscribe, come and watch, come and follow, and all that stuff, so they can learn some design too. And I hope you have fun today. I'll see you next time.